Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Robert Boedigheimer back to the stage. Robert, introduce yourself, and it's all yours. Thanks so
All
much.
right. So a little bit about myself. So as he said, I do a lot of conference speaking. So typically in person. So it's been obviously a different year. I've been doing a lot more virtual events. But my full-time job, I work on an e-commerce website focused on things like performance and security and new techniques. So that's what I do normally. I also am a Pluralsight author, so it happens to be free month of April for Pluralsight. So I do have 9 courses on various topics: cryptography, performance, 2 courses on Fiddler, troubleshooting. So if you're interested in that, you've got a few more days to take advantage of that. I also have my Twitter. That's my email. That's my blog information. And I am making the slides and code available. So I have a link on the very end that will point you to that if you're interested. So we'll jump right into some of the performance rules. So I used to work on compilers quite a few years ago. And so when I started looking at web performance, I was pretty new to C#, ASP.NET. I really thought I was going to be spending time on back-end code, like troubleshooting, making C# faster. Around the time I was looking, Steve Soders put out his very excellent book on web performance. He had 14 different tips, and the main thing I took from it was 80 or 90% of the typical website, the time is spent waiting for page resources. So JavaScript, images, CSS. It's typically not optimizing server-side code. I will show you how you can actually tell if server-side code is your problem or not, but typically it isn't. Some of the rules we want to follow. You want to make fewer HTTP requests. I put this in italics because I'm going to talk about HTTP 2 changes this slightly, but in general, don't request stuff you don't need. But there were some techniques we used to use solely to reduce the number of requests that you probably don't want to in the HTTP 2 world anymore. You want to send as little data as possible, and you want to send it as infrequently as possible. So I'm going to talk about Fiddler. I'm going to use the tool throughout the talk here. It was a tracing tool built specifically for HTTP and HTTPS. So years and years ago when I was troubleshooting, it wasn't around. So I would use Microsoft Network Monitor, which is similar to Wireshark. It's possible to troubleshoot with that. The problem is it's not tailored just for HTTP. So Eric Lawrence was working at Microsoft and working on a team that needed to support people that had problems with websites, didn't know C#, didn't know .NET, didn't know HTTP, and spent his weekends writing Fiddler, which I think is cool. It was acquired by Telerik in 2012, and they've now been acquired by Progress. I gave you a link here where you can get Fiddler. And I want to mention that I'm using Fiddler Classic. There's a few features in it that I want to use that are specific to that version. Fiddler Everywhere is out now, which is cool because most of you have probably used Fiddler Classic before. Fiddler Everywhere, the big wins are they've redone the user interface to make it a lot more modern, and they've also made it cross-platform. So if you're on Mac or on Linux, that's now available to you to download there as well. So I'm going to show you, I've got a fictional travel site here. I'm going to close my sandbox. So I'm going to open up Fiddler as well. So for the talk, I've got fictional travel page. Pretty straightforward. I'm not a designer, so I used Bootstrap. I think it looks pretty decent. I've done the exact same thing before and after using these techniques. So let's focus on what we'll use Fiddler for here. So I'm going to select the requests that are made. So I like to show this to new web developers. I also like to show it to marketing people just so they understand a web page is not a single request and response. You're going to make a request, get back the HTML, but then you're going to usually get a lot of JavaScript, CSS, images. Most web pages today are roughly 75 requests and about 3 meg. So if we look at the statistics here, I can see I made 12 requests, which is much less than normal, but you can see I'm close to the 3 meg, and I can see the various sizes here for JavaScript files and CSS and images. So now I want to show the same thing after. So with the after, what I've done is I wanted to make it look exactly the same, but I wanted to take advantage of most of the performance techniques I'll talk about today, just to show you kind of a before and after and what a difference you can make by using these techniques. So if I click on this, we'll see I have 13 requests, but I'm down to 187K. So if we were to go back, I had Bootstrap itself was bigger than that, and I have images and jQuery. There's a whole lot of files that were bigger than the entire page is now. So again, using these techniques, visually you can't tell that we've done all those things, but we'll see what kind of an impact that has on performance and saving money as well. It's important when you do performance to think about what metrics you're going to use. So I mentioned the first byte. So the first byte is more IT focused. So this is just how long it took your browser to make a request to the web server for the web server to execute the page and return the first byte. So when we look later at some of the web page tests and such, if it does turn out your first byte is 2 or 3 seconds, then you do have a backend problem, right? I mean, how you're pulling data, something you're doing is making that slow. I'm instead typically focused on what's called speed index. So speed index was created by web page test years ago, and it was meant to be a good metric for how fast the major content in your viewport paints. So it's tied more to what a customer would see or what they would experience as far as how long it takes to render the bulk of your page. There's a few others I'll skip over for now. Chrome has introduced Core Web Vitals recently, and they're trying to say there's really 3 major components that go into performance. Largest contentful paint is somewhat similar to speed index. It's just the main content on your page. When is that visible? First input delay. By the time I see my page, how long is it before I can actually click and interact with anything? And the last one is cumulative layout shift. I'm sure you've been to web pages where everything kind of moves around as it's rendering. It's very disconcerting, and we want that to not happen. So that's also part of the measurement. So focus on, there's a ton of other metrics, but pick the metrics that make sense for you. And then we want to make sure that we're measuring. So I'm going to show you a good website for doing that. It's called Web Page Test. So what I can do, I can come out here and choose various locations around the world with different types of browsers and different types of connections. There's also some mobile devices I can choose, but I can come and put in a public website. And if you do need to ever use this internally, Web Page Test does have instances that you can download and run internally if you like the tool. So I pre-ran this against my before and after. So I like to, before I do any performance changes, I like to run this. I can save that URL. So I would have gone on the previous screen and just typed in my URL. I keep this link because they keep the history of this so I can look at it over time. So I'm going to get this before I do anything. And let's just take a look. I've got a couple scores up here. They're telling me I'm not doing compression, I'm not caching. We'll get into what those things are. The first byte looks okay. And then here are a lot of the major metrics. So if I looked, it's telling me it's about 5.4 seconds before the speed index says most of my page is visible. I can see the core vitals, and it gives me an indication that I'm not too bad on the first paint of the largest. I do have some shifting going on, and my blocking time is not too bad. I like to pop into the waterfall. So if you've seen waterfall diagrams before, here's my HTML request. It shows me the DNS lookup, how long the connection took, and then I can see it downloading resources. And you can see just by looking, I've got some images that are taking from, right around 1.5 seconds out to almost 7.5 seconds. So it tells me right away I've got some images that are probably larger than I want them to be. And I also have a pretty large CSS file. And then if I go look down below, we'll talk about HTTP 2 later. HTTP 1.1 will open up 6 connections per host. So you can see that I hosted all of my content on that website on the same host, but it still forced my browser to open up six different connections. And you can see that each one of them took a while to get connected. So we'll talk about how that will get improved as we go forward. The other feature I like, it records a video. So I find it's helpful for non-technical people or people that don't like to hear percentages. It's very impactful to show them this is my customer's experience, right? You'll see it shifts around. It took about 5.8 seconds before the page looked like it was ready to go. Now, if I ran that same exact test against the after version, we'll take a look at how that looks. Sorry, I pulled up the wrong one. You can see I'm scoring better across the board. I have some stuff I need to do from a security perspective with headers and such. But if we look, my speed index went from about 5.5 seconds down to 1. And you can see that all my core vitals now are excellent and green. And if I look at the waterfall, you'll see it looks like it's the same width and everything, but we're only out to 1.1 seconds here, not 8 seconds. So you can see it takes a while to start up each connection, DNS, connecting. I used HTTPS for this. All of the sites today should be using HTTPS, so I did that. And then you'll notice I'm using HTTP 2. If I were to click on this, you can see I'm using HTTP 2. That allows me to download all of the resources in parallel. So I'm not limited to 6 things at once. So if we look at the connection view, you can see I used one single connection to get all of those resources, and they were able to come down in parallel. So that's another win. If we look at the video, you can see the difference. You remember before is about 5.5 seconds before you really saw anything. Now we're at 1 second, and the paint was excellent. It basically came and painted directly done rather than kind of shifting around and looking like it was still in progress. So again, you want to do that type of measurement. There's also 2 other ways to measure. So we pay a service to do synthetic monitoring for us. And what that means is we have a set number of cities across the United States that hit various pages on our website every hour. So I have this consistent connection with the same browser, same location, forever. So I'm able to do performance improvements. And I can see they call it lab data because I'm controlling the clients. But it's nice because if I do tweak something, I can go run it and I can do a nice apple-to-apple comparison that I got 20% faster or 50% faster or whatever it turns out to be. So that's good for synthetic. We've also recently just lit up real user monitoring, or RUM. You embed JavaScript on your page, and the browsers now have these two different standards where the browsers are recording data about every image, CSS, and JavaScript file it downloads, and it reports it back. So now I can see every individual customer to my website, what was their experience like. So if they came in and filled out a survey and said, your site was kind of slow yesterday, I could actually drill in, search for their customer number, find their actual RUM experience, and I could pinpoint exactly which part of that was slow. I can see waterfall diagrams. I can see maybe a third-party tag was too slow. So again, it's important. Pick your metrics, do measurements. You need to be able to see when things are getting better or worse and why.
Hey, Robert, can you hear me? We lost your...
You're muted, Robert.
I'm sorry. Okay. Hopefully that was a recent mute. So I was just saying, Amazon and Walmart both did A/B tests where they intentionally slowed their website by 1/10 of a second. And coincidentally, both of them lost 1% of their sales. I would love to know that number for my website. We have a lot of debates internally about, can we use a new font or can we use a new technique? And I'll say that's going to make stuff slower, but I don't know the direct impact to sales. If I could measure and do that A/B test internally, then every time somebody wanted to add something and make it something slower, I could tell them that's okay, you can add that font, but you're going to lose 1% of your sales. So if you think you're getting enough branding or whatever you get by adding new fonts, I hope you're making up the 1% of sales you'd lose. So it's important to understand how sensitive are your customers to web performance, because that would help you sell a lot of the techniques we'll talk about, because you could equate it to money then. You could say, I just saved you 3 seconds and you just made X amount more money. So that's good to know. It helps to compare yourself to competitors. So there is SpeedCurve is a RUM developer, and they actually put out some nice metrics. So I'm just going to show you my segment for e-commerce is retail. So I can go look on slow connections using speed index with retail. I can see how does Target fit, where's Amazon. So if my site happened to be 3 seconds, people internally might say, well, that seems slow. I always thought you're supposed to be 2 seconds. I can come out and say, well, comparing to all of these other major vendors, we're actually doing pretty well. So it helps you to benchmark, and you can try different connection speeds and different metrics, but it helps you understand how well you're doing. So I'm going to start jumping into techniques now. The good news is that these techniques work regardless of what framework or web server you're using. They apply everywhere. We have a lot of them, so I'm not going to try to show you how to configure them all. So it's more important to me that you understand what the technique is and why it's useful, and then you can look into how would you configure that for your particular environment. So the first one is compression. So with compression, the idea, if you've used PKZip and those sorts of products before, browsers know how to send to the server, and they put this accept encoding on to say that they understand how to do compression. And there's really 3 standards today. gzip and deflate have been around forever. Brotli is a pretty new one. I put it in italics just because I happen to be IIS and ASP.NET, so it's not supported natively yet. It's slower, but it does better compression. So we had our data center, in rural Minnesota at the time, we were running out of bandwidth. So we had to come up with ideas. So this was, 15, 20 years ago. We turned on compression, and we noticed the next day we cut our bandwidth usage in half. So just by compressing our JavaScript and CSS and HTML, we basically cut half our bandwidth. So we got half our bandwidth back for free. And we also saw that we were 25% faster with the synthetic measurements I talked about before. So really easy win. I'll show you what it will look like in Fiddler. So I'm just going to clear this and go back and run the after. I hit Control F5 to force it to refresh. And if I come back in here, we'll see Bootstrap is about 37K. If I look at the inspectors, I can see that I have compression on. If I didn't use compression, it would be 160K. So we went from 160K down to about 37K just by turning on compression. Again, you can see Brotli should be even smaller. And again, if your product supports it, it's a little slower compression, but it's a lot smaller download. Compression is a good one. I've also stacked these techniques in pretty much a guaranteed win to a little more work. With that being said, always test this stuff, right? I mean, turn it on for yourself, run it for your website. Traditionally, this should be an easy win for everybody. And the rare occasion it doesn't work for you, you've got the before and after to know why it doesn't work or why it doesn't improve things for you. But that's a good thing to take advantage of. Next one is content expirations. So the idea is if you came to my website today, you're going to run my ASP.NET page. I'm going to give you back the HTML. You're going to download all my JavaScript, CSS, and images. I would love if you close your browser, you come back tomorrow and you visit again. I want you to ask for the ASP.NET page because things might have changed. But if it turns out nothing has changed since yesterday, I want you to use CSS, JavaScript, and images on your own machine, right? Your browser's already caching this. It's not going to get faster than pulling it right off your own machine. I don't want you to come back to my servers and ask for it again. So if you've ever done traces and you see this if modified since header with a 304 response, you basically had the browser decide to come back to you and ask for something, even though it had it locally. So you can actually set expiration. So for me, I do CSS and JavaScript. I'll set for a year. And then the images, I happen to choose 30 days. So these are in seconds. But you just configure your web server and say, I don't want people to come back. Because if you don't do this, what happens? Browsers make up their own mind. So when the person came back the next day, if the browser's unsure, it could look and say, you know, I already have this file right here, but I'm going to come back and ask you. That trip back to my web server takes my server load, takes my bandwidth, uses your data plan. And usually if the files are small, it took just as long to ask if it had been refreshed to get the actual file. So I really want to avoid that. So set expirations so you are in control of when that happens. If it turns out that you did have to make a change, so let's say I had a fix I had to put out in Bootstrap, all I need to do is change the URL. So it's something different. So if you notice, it just happens on this line up top here. They have this v equals 212. They just tacked a version number on. That will break the browser cache. So you get the best of both worlds. Cache it while you can, and then use a version number when you need to force it to update to a new version, if that makes sense. Next one is Content Delivery Network, or a CDN. So it's funny how things work. Two engineers were arguing in a bar, and they said, what matters more, bandwidth or latency? So if you're familiar, every time you go to an ISP, they're always saying, we have 10 megabit per second, or we have 100 megabit, or we have gigabit, and that's all they ever talk about. So they actually did an experiment. You can go out here and read the article. But they said, let's control one of the variables versus the other. So bandwidth or latency. And latency is just how long it takes, you know, speed of light, transmission, whatever, for you to reach the server and get a response. So they varied the bandwidth, and the curve shows that as you get better bandwidth, it gets better for a while, but it plateaus out pretty fast. You know, if you're not Netflix, right? We're not talking streaming, we're talking a normal website. It turns out if you have less latency, it's just always better. So in the long run, you want to really avoid latency, is where you're going to get the biggest wins. So I'm still hosted in Minnesota for my website. So you're all across the US potentially, or if people across the world, if they were to visit, I don't want them to all have to come back to Minnesota to get my data. So a CDN has a global network of servers that are geographically closer to my users than my data center. So I will offload my images, CSS, JavaScript, and fonts to be hosted on my CDN. And then I'll show you what that will do. So let's take a look at. So here I've got, you know, this is how I would normally reference an image that was in my website. If I were example.com and I got a CDN, they would give me typically a subdomain name like cdn.example.com. I will start referencing all of my resources using that name. I happen to use protocol lists, which just means if the page uses HTTPS, use it. Years ago, we had the mixture, so I just got used to doing protocol lists. Today, I could just type HTTPS if I wanted to. So now what happens if you visit from St. Louis and you're the first person who's gone to my website, the magic of the CDN is when it looks up, it does a DNS lookup for cdn.example.com. It's going to give you back an IP address that's as close of a server, a CDN server, as possible to where your location is. Therefore, if you're the first visitor, you're going to go to that CDN server. It won't be cached yet. That CDN server comes back to me, gets this flag image, and then it caches it locally. Now, everybody else who visits, that uses that same CDN server will pull the flag from that location instead of coming back to Minnesota. So subsequent visitors are going to have a lot better experience. And again, all that load off of me goes away. So the good news is CDNs are really cheap. There's a lot of them. It just makes sense to take advantage of them and reduce that time. I think our time, we cut like 25% off our synthetic again, just by using CDNs and having stuff be served closer to the customer than us. And it does honor all of my expirations. So if I tell it not to ask for a new image for a month, that'll be cached at the CDN server for a month. So everybody will pull it from there rather than hit my servers. So again, it just helps your performance. And it makes sense for us. All of our images, CSS, JavaScript, and fonts, we put on a CDN just to have them closer. And then the ASP.NET requests come back to my main server. We'll talk about bundling and minification. I'm going to focus on minification first. And the idea is you should minify your CSS and your JavaScript, possibly your HTML. I know people do it. Sometimes it messes up your layouts, and I haven't found a good tool that does my dynamic ASP.NET pages, so I don't do that, but I do all my CSS and JavaScript. So let me show you what that looks like. So I showed you I use Bootstrap. You can see Bootstrap is about 134K, and this looks like what you'd expect, right? Readable JavaScript. If I go look at the after version of that, you can see I'm down to 59K. So I went from 134. So I cut it in more than half just by minifying. And if I display what that looks like, you've probably seen this before, right? Because again, customers using your site don't care what your JavaScript looks like. I want to minify it and make it run faster. If you need to troubleshoot as a developer, you can use DevTools Pretty Print, and it will bring back an approximation of the original source. Or I use source maps. So I can actually, if you open DevTools, it will actually come back and pull the main bootstrap.js. So my troubleshoot experience is just like I didn't minify, but for all my customers, it's actually doing the minification. In the HTTP 1.1 days, we talked about there's only 6 connections per host. So we actually took all of our JavaScript files and bundled them. We minified them, and then we bundle them into a single JavaScript file. Because in the HTTP 1.1 world, it would penalize me to have a lot of individual JavaScript requests. So when we did both of those two things, we cut our homepage time by nearly half. So some simple build tools took probably 6 hours to set up. Every time I do a build of our production website, it's doing this bundling and minification to save us that download time and improve performance. I'll talk about why the bundling is in question if you're using HTTP 2 when we get to that later. Okay. Next area you can spend a lot of time on is the images. So years ago, I've been doing web forever. Designers wanted to use a certain font on their web pages. Well, in the old days, there weren't web fonts. And so you had to use what was called web-safe fonts. So you had to make sure you were only using fonts that you knew would be on most of the people's computers that came to visit. So what people would do instead, they would make an image that had the font, the text with the font they wanted, and they'd serve it as an image instead. Or if you used to do gradients where you had a red kind of eventually become white, you had to do that with images too. Now that CSS3 supports web fonts and gradients and other things, if you can do things in CSS3, it'll be smaller than using the same concept using images. So if you can do that, just be aware you should do that. Next thing to do is focus on using the proper type. So if you're using logos, you want to use SVG. So SVG is a vector graphic, which just means that it uses mathematical formulas. So I have a responsive website for our e-commerce site, so it looks good on tablets, phones, and desktop. Because I have those different resolutions and sizes, if I use an SVG, it will automatically scale. So no matter what device the customer uses, the SVG will look exactly the same. So if I can use an SVG for things like logos with few colors and stuff, that's what you should use. If you're using photos today, you want to use JPEG. There's a couple other newer options. I didn't list WebP. AVIF looks very promising. JPEG XL looks even better. I'll show you if you haven't seen this before. You can go out to Can I Use? You can punch in various HTML, CSS features. I put in AVIF and you can actually see how well supported that is across browsers today. So if I were to do this, I have a lot of mobile customers. It wouldn't work on Safari. So I would have to do some sort of polyfill to make that work. So I'm still today doing JPEGs. And I'll show you why you want to do it for photos. So if I were to give you a quick example, I often have people say, you can do image photos using PNGs. So I'll go in here and say, yes, that's true. I'm going to show you the details here. So I've got one as a PNG. So if you go to Sydney, so I've been to Sydney a couple times, you can actually walk up the bridge, which is kind of fun. But this is a picture of people going up and down the bridge. This is the PNG version. If I save the same thing as a JPEG, you can see the visual quality is the same. But if you look at the size difference, the JPEG is 58K and the PNG is 516K. And I'm going to show you why that is. You can actually compress JPEGs a lot better. And again, if you get in a debate, stand them both up, right? If you not sure, create it in both versions and compare. And what I've seen, the JPEGs for photos, if you compress them right, will beat the PNGs. Next thing to focus on is responsive images. So I talked about being responsive design. So we want our site to look good on a phone, a tablet, or a desktop. Years ago, all we had was image source, right? So when responsive design first started, you had to be able to support a phone with a poor connection and a small screen. You only need a small image compared to my desktop with high pixel density where I might need a really nice image. Well, in the old days with image source, most people pointed to the desktop version because they had to have the best. And then the people who were on a mobile phone were suffering downloading a huge image that they didn't need to display. Now browsers, the community actually came together and came up with source set and picture. So I'm going to show you quickly what that looks like. It took me a little bit to embrace. I like to have control of things. So it took me a while to embrace this, but skip the data dash here for a moment. What I can do is I can create the same image with various widths. And if I use source set on an image tag, I'm telling the browser, you figure out the best one. Browsers might look at connection speed, pixel density. They know how much of the design surface they need. They'll pick the best image to pull in that situation. That's where source set is a huge advantage. So if I go back and look at the sizes again, 128 width of that bridge walk's only 2K. The full desktop size one's 187K. That's almost 100 times larger that you would have been downloading to a phone, even though they didn't need it to display it, or even on a desktop in a place where you're only showing it as a really small image. So being able to take advantage of source set and picture lets you do different crops and things. We've used source set primarily for our site, and I had to give up that control. But you notice I also embed the widths into the file name. So when I look at my web logs, I can see which sizes are being downloaded the most. And when I look in Fiddler, I can see obviously which one's being downloaded. So that's responsive images. Client hints is coming. And it's the idea where instead of doing source set and picture, the browser will tell the server, here's my pixel density, here's other information about connection speed and such, so that the server could just choose the right image to send. And again, that's just a little new for me to be using in production, but so we'll get back to JPEGs. The advantage of a JPEG is you can trade off size versus quality. So you can often cut the size by 50% plus without impacting the visual quality. Every time, I guarantee. I say this in front of a designer or a marketing person, they kind of freak on me and, oh, we can't lose quality. I'm like, I'm not telling you to make it look horrible. I'm telling you there's a trade-off at which you can make it smaller and it still looks fine. And they usually don't like that answer, so I create a page like this. So I took the same image and I compressed it at various compressions. I gave them a couple freebies, right? That's too compressed. We're not going to use that. We're not going to use that. But I'll tell them, you find the original, and I'll let you use your original. And I've got ones that are a lot smaller. And if you can't tell the difference, and if you stare here, right, even side by side, it's hard to pick out a lot of visual differences between these. But if I were to hover, this one's 172K. This one down here is 47K. So I've cut that in about a third the size. So you can either use, I use PaintShop Pro, and literally I can say optimize this JPEG. It'll pull up 2 versions of it, and I can just play with the compression level until I see the one on the right is starting to get degraded. And then I can back it off to the point where the visual quality is the same, but I'm still got a lot smaller file size. And then if you use Photoshop, and you can even do this in PaintShop Pro, you can write a batch script that will optimize a series of images. So you can just say, go optimize this whole directory full of images and compress it for me to make it easier to set up. And that makes a huge difference in size. The other thing that's good is removing metadata. So I'm going to go back into Fiddler here. Fiddler has an extension you can download called Image Bloat. And what this does, it will tell me images that have metadata in them. So I'm going to hit Control F5. See, they visually look the same. It's the same exact image, except this one has metadata. So if I were to go show you what that looks like. So here is my original one. If you go look at the properties details, you can see I took it on a Canon PowerShot G1. Here's my shutter speed. None of my customers care about that, right? This is data that's making the file 15% larger and makes it slower to download. I can strip that out. So I use a tool called jpeg which is just a free command line tool that will remove that metadata. So I've got same visual quality, but you can see this was 47K. This is 32K. So if you go back to what we did originally, I went from 172K down to 32K by using proper compression and removing metadata. So that's a huge improvement for download times for your customers. Next thing with images is lazy loading. So we had years ago, we're a food site. So you come to our ice cream category and we might have 90 products on the page. We used to do paging like a search engine where we'd show you the first 9 or whatever, you'd hit page 2. Our designer came and said, I'd really love to have it be just one big page you could scroll through. So that's fine, but people are going to download every image on that page, even though they may never scroll down and look at it. So from a perf perspective, I wasn't excited about that. So we got this plugin, we still use this today, called Lazy Sizes. I'll show you what that does. Here's where this other trick comes in. So normally I would just do image with source set. This particular image happens to be one that I would say is below the fold. So if I go pull down the after, all of these images I don't lazy load, but these 3 images that are a little bigger, all 3 of those are lazy loaded. So all I needed to do is come and change the source set to say data-source set. Browsers ignore data-attributes, but JavaScript can read them. So by doing that, the browser sees an image tag without a source or a source set, it doesn't do anything. I put this lazy load class on. So you see, I just had to add the data dash and the lazy load. I include that JavaScript file here. And then what happens is, as the browser starts to scroll, it knows that this image is about to come into view. So it pulls the data dash off of the source set. So it's just source set. And then the browser wakes up and says, oh, it's a source set image. I got to go pick the right one and the right size. And it downloads it only at that time. So people who come and just want to see this and they give up on this page have not wasted my bandwidth or their own downloading these images. So my paint of the initial page is a lot faster because it's not waiting for those images that don't need to get displayed. There is native support. So Chrome just came out with a native implementation of this. But again, if you look at can I use, it doesn't have great support again yet. So I would have to do some sort of polyfill. So I'm today personally just sticking with lazy sizes. It's well used. We got good production experience. Someday I'm hoping that I can switch it to be native support, hoping that the browsers just kick in a little bit sooner potentially than when that JavaScript runs. But again, anything that you would consider below the fold is a good candidate for doing the lazy loading. Another thing I did is we have a lot of third-party scripts and beacons on our website, and I didn't want third-party stuff to impact my customer's experience. So I'll warn you, this is something I wrote myself. It uses a similar concept to what we just saw, but I've got this third-party JavaScript. Maybe it's analytics or something that isn't required for rendering the page. Instead of saying script source, I can say data-deferred script source. What this will do is my page will run. It'll render the main content. Once the onload event fires in the browser saying basically, most of the stuff is done, it will then run this method. This method just looks for any data-deferred source and changes it to source. So again, it'll just wait. It'll basically hold this off so that if that were slow or having any issues, it won't impact my main paint. So I've deferred virtually every third-party resource I use on my website to be after onload, which has given me a lot of stability and faster paints because I'm not relying on a random host on the internet to be working properly for my page to respond. So that's deferred loading. They've also added some features into JavaScript itself. So there's an async and a defer. So I'll show you again. I'm going to use one of the cool things about Fiddler is I can make things intentionally slow. So I'm going to turn off my image bloat. So what I did, I'll re-request the page. I can actually, so I don't want to do it because that'll cache something. I previously used the autoresponder and I made a request for the page and there's 3 JavaScript files on there. I just dragged the requests over and I made them intentionally slow. So you can see here if the browser asks for alert1.js, it's going to delay it by 4 seconds. 2 is 2 seconds and the third one is 3 seconds. So if I go back and show you what my page looks like, I've got these 3 JavaScript files and then I have my content. Since I made those intentionally slow, I just want to see what happens if my customer's trying to download my page and stuff is slow. What happens? Well, this happens, right? It's a blank page. My customers are looking at nothing until those JavaScript files finish, and then they see content. Something that's been added to browsers, if you don't need these for the initial paint, you can put the async keyword on them. Old browsers that don't understand these won't die. They just won't, it won't help. But if I turn that on, what I'm saying is don't wait for these to download. Download them in the background. As soon as they're done downloading, run them. So I'm going to run that again. The magic you see is my content is there right away. So the page paints faster. Now you'll see 2 ran first because it was only delayed 2 seconds, then the 3, and then 1. So a couple important notes on that, right? If I don't care about the order and it's not required for painting, I'm allowing it to show my content faster. It's not quite as good as the deferred. I work with a lot of vendors and they say, we use async, it's perfect, we can't affect performance. Not really, you can. All you're saying is wait until the browser downloads this and then execute it. If it turns out I'm still parsing content when this is downloaded, it'll still run and still block my rendering. So if you can defer using the technique I showed before, that's better. You're truly pushing it off and controlling when it will run, but async is useful. If I put defer, I'm saying same thing. I want you to not block painting, but I want these to execute in order. So you can see I got the paint right away. but now it's going to wait for 1 to be done, then 2, and then 3. So if you have dependencies with your JavaScript, you want to use defer. Also, browsers have been adding in a lot of what they call resource hints. So I'll just show you what that looks like. So I have this JavaScript file down here that's going to pull in from ajax.microsoft.com. Typically, I would self-host this for real, but this is good for demos. If I'm going to do this, what would happen by default is the browser would parse. It would eventually come down and hit this line, and then it would start doing a connection and everything. I can use these resource hints, and I can tell the browser, as soon as you see this meta tag, start the connection to Microsoft. You need to do a DNS lookup, you need to get a TCP connection, you need to do an HTTPS handshake. It's possible by doing this pre-connect. All of that will be done before it actually hits the parser down here and needs to download the file. So I've seen examples where this makes a huge difference because it gets a pre-start on getting that connection. You can even preload the file. And by the way, I put them all in as meta tags. You can actually have these be response headers. So you can configure your web server to send this back so the browser will see the response headers before it even starts to parse the page. So it could give you another jump on getting out to Microsoft faster. There's another cool one. I don't use this. I'll give you that caveat. If you have a website that if they came to a given page, you're almost certain where they're going to go next, you can use pre-render. What that does is it says, I'm pretty confident you're going to go to this page next. Finish doing everything for this page first. And then in the background, go get this page and any images, JavaScript, CSS, and start doing the render process. So if your customer is sitting looking at your page, in the background, they're actually out getting this other page, getting it all pre-rendered. When they click a link, it might just show up instantly. So the advantage is that's great. If you know where someone's going to go next, this technique might be a huge win for you. If you're not, you're basically wasting their data plan, downloading stuff in the background they may never view. So you've got some trade-offs there. Like I said, I don't have that predictable of a path that I take advantage of this, but if that works for you, that could be an easy win. Talk about some miscellaneous things. Lately, I've been focusing more on critical rendering path, which just means I really am hyper-focused on how to get the first stuff in the viewport painted. So I've been looking at things like inlining critical CSS. So I've got this big pile of CSS my site needs. There's tools that will split that up and say, they analyze your page and say, you know, to paint this stuff in the top of the viewport, you only need this little bit of CSS. You then inline that directly into your HTML. So when your browser starts parsing the HTML, it doesn't need to wait for the CSS to be downloaded. It can instantly start to use that CSS and do the paint of your critical content, and then download the rest of your CSS in the background and have it apply for the stuff that's below the fold. I've had mixed luck with tooling on that. I've seen some people that it's been wildly successful, but it's just one of the techniques I'm looking at. Again, lazy loading, anything I can do, deferring third parties, anything to make that first paint faster is really where I've been focusing lately. Another thing to be aware of is URLs are case sensitive if you didn't know that. So you can see I've got a page here that's got the same image referenced 4 times. 2 times it's all lowercase. The other times it's got a capital F on this one and a capital FB on this one. Even the most recent browsers will treat those separately. So if I were to pull that and go into Fiddler, you can see that even though it's the exact same image, the browser had to download it 3 times. Is it likely that you're going to do this 3 times in a row on one page? No. But what it told us was we needed to make a standard for our site. So we chose to say all resources are going to be all lowercase because it's very possible that I like title casing personally. I like how that looks, capital F, capital B. I would have done that on my homepage. Another developer needs the same image. They like lowercase. We would have defeated everything I'd done before. all the caching. So you hit mine, downloaded it, it's in your cache on your browser. But because they did lowercase, it has to come all the way back to my server, waste my bandwidth, waste your time, right? So we just made a rule that said everything, all of our resources are lowercase, so we never get impacted by needing to download more than once the same thing just because our casing is wrong. Strict transport security. So I won't spend a lot of time on this. We use HTTPS for our website. So anybody who types HTTP will come to the server. I'm going to redirect them and say, please use HTTPS, and then they'll come back. If you set the strict transport security response header, you can tell the browser, never use HTTP for my site again for X amount of time. So we got our site to be all HTTPS. Then I set that transport security and said for the next year, never do HTTP. So most people just sit down and type www. If they've been here before, they'll know to go straight to HTTPS. I won't talk about font setting too much either, given our time. I will talk about HTTP2. So I've got a full hour-long talk on this. We don't have that much time. So I'm going to focus on, from a performance perspective, the biggest win with HTTP2 is they said we're going to stop using 6 connections per host. We're going to use one single TCP connection and multiplex all of the resources over that one connection using priorities correctly. In other words, get the most important stuff as fast as possible on a single connection. So I'll show you what that means. I'm going to shut Fiddler here. Let me go over and run. So I hate this demo. I like this demo at the same time, and I'll tell you why. So this is using HTTP. There's 360 check marks on here. If I use HTTPS, that's weird, right? That's 87% faster to use encryption. How does that work? Well, if I have HTTPS configured, then I can use HTTP2. By using HTTP2, instead of only downloading 6 of these check marks at a time because of that 6 connection limit, it's going to download them all in parallel. So why I don't like this demo, I don't have a page that has 360 check marks on it, right? You probably don't either. But if you're a typical website, I do have pages that have 50 images, CSS, and JavaScript I need pulled from my CDN. So turning on HTTP2 was easy to set up, and I get a lot more parallel downloads at the same time. So you can see some real performance improvements with that. I've taught a lot of techniques over the years that you probably want to stop doing when you do HTTP2. These were all cheats to work around reducing the number of requests you made to fit in those 6 connections. So I talked before, I bundled all of my JavaScript into a JavaScript file and all my CSS into a single CSS file. Now that HTTP2 is here, there's a lot of research and debate about this. They're not saying don't bundle at all. Don't go back to 15 individual JavaScript files necessarily. But the penalty of downloading separate resources is not high in HTTP2 because of that single connection. So there's still some compression advantages. So it's probably better to bundle, like when you get in my checkout process, here's all my checkout related stuff. Bundle that together. So you got to play with that on your own, but don't bundle just to reduce requests if you use HTTP2. Again, measure and see the difference, but probably not wise. We also used to do CSS sprites. We had a bunch of really small images on our page. We'd combine them into one image and then use CSS to index into that, again, to reduce requests. Probably not useful here. People also did domain sharding. So I showed you I had cdn.example.com that had 6 connections. They said, well, if I make a cdn1.example.com and a cdn2, I have 12 more connections, so I can get 18 things in parallel. True, but each one of those connections have to go through the connection setup process. So most people that did this technique in the past would do about 3, but again, not an advantage anymore for HTTP2. And lastly, people were inlining things. So you could actually take small images, base 64, and code them and they were called a data URI, that you could embed that small image directly into your HTML. So it didn't have to do a request. Bad news is base 64 encoding, they were about 33% larger, and you couldn't cache them across pages. But some people did it because they really wanted to reduce requests. Again, in an HTTP2 world, that probably doesn't make sense. Same with CSS and JavaScript. The only caveat I gave is that if you're doing the critical CSS I talked about, inlining that still makes sense for that small critical CSS you need to display right away. Next, I want to look at some tools. Page speed is good, but I'm going to focus on Lighthouse. So I'm going to pull up my before version of the site. I'm going to hit F12. And if I go to Lighthouse, DevTools now has built-in audits. So I can say, please run a performance audit on mobile for this page. So it's going to go run some heuristics and figure out a score. So I scored 64 out of 100. But what's cool about this, I can look at the calculator and I can look at the metrics and I can see my largest contentful paint took about 11 seconds. So I scored nothing on that. So out of all these things, focusing on trying to make my largest contentful paint a lot smaller would boost my score. So if I could do that, I'm suddenly in a pretty acceptable range. So it tells me what I can focus on. I also, if I scroll down, it will tell me a lot of the things we've talked about during this talk, right? My images are too big. I need to compress those. Get rid of unused JavaScript and CSS, minify my CSS. Usually it will tell me use HTTP2 or other techniques like that. I'm going to go run the same thing against my after. So this is another metric I use internally just to communicate, because Google is starting to use Lighthouse and Core Vitals to score. Sweet, still 100. So I got 100 now instead. This is going to impact my rankings. And again, it's a good metric to just sum up for people. Our performance was a 64. We did these techniques. Now I'm at 100. There's still things I could focus on. And if I don't understand what these mean, what I like about this is I can go learn more about, like, well, exactly how would I do this? And I can follow a link and look at that. So if you're pretty new to performance and you want to spot check, get your current score, I would do that, capture that, save that, see what it looks like after, and look at some of these hints down here about what you should focus on. Pluralsight courses, so I have a full web performance course that goes into all the detail of how you specifically compress images and such. I have one on responsive images and how to use source set and picture. My most recent one is debugging your website with Fiddler and Chrome DevTools. So basically, your site has a problem, like styles don't look right. Should I use Fiddler or should I use DevTools? And it walks through, here's your problem. So very much you have a problem with your site. Which tool is appropriate? Maybe both, and it walks through how you should do that. And then I have one that gets into very advanced Fiddler techniques. So again, Pluralsight happens to be free in April. So if you want to sign up for the trial, go do that. For some strange reason, it'll make you watch all 9 of my courses first. No, it won't really, but you certainly can take advantage of this while you have a few more days left in April. That again is my Twitter, my email, my blog. This is the link to the slide and the code. So I have the code both before and after. So you can see and compare without doing any of the techniques and with doing the techniques. So with that, if there's any questions people would like to review, we have a little bit of time here to go through some of those.
Robert, there's a couple of questions in the chat.
So that's a lot of techniques kind of fast, but I don't know. Is there anything in the chat or does anybody want to come off mute and ask anything?
So how do these techniques work with things like Xamarin?
How do they work with Xamarin? So that's a very good question. So we actually use Xamarin as a hybrid app with a browser. So we have apps that are really browsers pointed at our website. So we get all those website advantages. If you're doing Xamarin, I would have to think if you're still doing browser conversation. So what's your Xamarin app? I mean, it's like a native app.
Well, I mean, we use it for it's a native app. We use it for things like accessing documentation on the
Okay.
fly, and we don't know whether they're going to have an iPad, some other Chrome pad, an iPhone, an Android phone, or they're going to be looking at it on a PC. And the idea is to write it once, because
Yep.
the content changes quickly, but the flow of what it is doesn't.
So are you doing like we're doing, where you're pulling most of the content off back-end web APIs?
We're pulling most of the content really literally out of databases.
Okay.
It's just it's 99% text with a little bit of wrapper around it, so you got some, you can go back to the table of contents and look at the chapters or things like that.
Yep, but you're not using a browser control within Xamarin. You're doing really native screens making database calls, raw database calls, not like HTTP calls.
Right.
So I'm not sure how much of this would benefit you if you're not making HTTP calls, like the compression, the expirations, all of those things are really HTTP based things. I would imagine if you're pulling images and such, all the compression techniques would still make sense. The metadata removals.
There's a lot of images. There's a lot of drawings. I mean, they're formal drawings of things. We get those out of the drawing database.
Okay. And are they SVG sort of things, or are they bitmappy drawings?
Yeah, they're bitmappy. Yeah, mostly for the most part. Some of them are 40 years old.
Yeah, so most of that
scanned images.
Okay. Most of that, I guess I would focus on, are you using JPEGs and such for those formats that you could take advantage of compression on, right? The metadata removal would still make sense, but if you're not really talking HTTP, then you won't get advantages from HTTP2 or compression or expiration or any of those sorts of things, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. So if you don't have any more questions, feel free, like I said, follow me on Twitter, follow up with an email if you'd like after you look at the code. Wait a couple more minutes, but feel free to reach out afterwards if you have specific techniques you had more questions about.
Robert, there are a couple questions in the chat.
Okay. Pop over here and see if I can. Oops, I had it. Can I still make web faster if we activate HTTP2 on Azure App Service and using anti-CSRF Forge or other image related? So certainly you want, so you have, got to check your wording there, HTTPS on Azure App Service. Do you also mean was the 2 for HTTP2? If logic populating field is on JS, how to handle JS? Anyway, I have no data until all of this or has loading by JS not recommended. So I'm not sure how to take the second question either. If logic populating field is on JS. So basically, if JavaScript is what's populating the screen, how to handle JS dependency on loading the page. So you still can use the module techniques and things you're doing for loading, and you'll still get all the advantages of the compression and the expirations and other stuff we talked about. And then whether or not you can defer those JavaScript depends on if some of those are not needed to paint the main part of the page, I would async or defer them or do my deferred technique so that you can segment off the JavaScript that's not important for the paint, because typically you've got lots of JavaScript for frameworks, not all of which is needed for the main paint. So I would focus on serving the normal JavaScript the normal way with compression, and then deferring all of the other JavaScript so those modules can load but won't impact the first paint, if that makes sense. Hopefully that's what you're looking for. And if not, feel free to type that in or. Okay, so I don't see a lot of other questions in there.
Robert, I think this has been a great presentation. Thanks so much for your time.
I can barely hear you. Better.
Yep. Thanks so much for your time tonight.
Oh, you're welcome.
Had a great presentation. Really appreciate your time, and thanks for coming by.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah. I'm going to stop the recording now. Thanks everybody for participating.